There was a day when the sun did not rise, not in a metaphorical sense, not as a literary expression of a political tragedy or a spiritual crisis, in a literal, physical, verifiable way. On May 19, 1780, across a vast swath of the northeastern American continent, the sky went dark in the middle of the morning as if someone had covered the world with a black glass dome. Candles were not enough to light the rooms. The birds fell silent and returned to their nests as if night had arrived without permission. The men plowing the field stopped in the middle of the furrow, looked up, and found nothing where the sun should have been. Only a yellow-green blanket that smelled of something for which no language of the time had words to describe. The surviving records of that day in New England, on the coasts of Canada, in the valleys of the Connecticut River, agree on one thing with a unanimity that is unsettling to anyone who reads them slowly. No one, absolutely no one, knew what was happening. But this is where the official story ends and where the true story, the one that doesn't appear in textbooks, the one that was buried not out of malice but out of misunderstanding, begins to emerge from the cracks of what is known. Because that day was not merely an unexplained atmospheric phenomenon. That day was the last visible sign of something that had been dying for years, for decades, perhaps for centuries in silence. On the margins of the world we were building while we forgot the one that already existed. That day was the end of Tartaria. And if you've never heard that name, or if you've heard it only as a rumor or a curiosity circulating in the least frequented corners of historical discourse, then what you're about to discover isn't simply a piece of alternative history. It's a question that changes the way you look at everything around you, the buildings in your city, the domes crowning the oldest buildings in any capital in the world. An architectural style that appears, with minimal variations, on continents that, according to the books, had no contact with one another for centuries. The year is 1780. The place is a world on the verge of forgetting itself. And what you're about to explore is not just a theory. It is the reconstruction, hour by hour, detail by detail, of the final hours of a civilization that time decided to erase. To understand what happened on May 19, 1780, you must first understand what the world was like in that year from two simultaneous and radically different perspectives. Because 1780 was not just a year on the calendar of the history we know, it was the crossroads between two eras, between two versions of humanity, between two ways of understanding what it means to inhabit the earth. The official version of the world in that year painted a recognizable picture. In the American colonies, the revolution against the British Crown had been burning for 5 years with an intensity that fascinated and terrified the courts of Europe in equal measure. In France, Louis XVI ruled over a kingdom that carried within it, like a seed of fire, the revolution that would erupt 9 years later and redefine the very idea of government, citizenship, and power. In the Russian Empire, Catherine the Great was consolidating a dominion that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, absorbing territories that no one in the Western courts had ever set foot on. It was a world of expanding empires, of cartographers who were drawing for the first time with some precision the contours of continents that the European imagination had populated for centuries with monsters and blank spaces. It was a world that was learning to know itself through reason, through nascent science, through the Enlightenment conviction that the universe was a comprehensible mechanism that human intelligence could, given enough time, take apart and put back together. But beneath that history, beneath the courts and the maps and the Enlightenment manifestos, there was another history, a history that was not written in the newspapers because its protagonists had no newspapers, or if they did, those newspapers disappeared. A history that did not appear in diplomatic treaties because their territories were not recognized as nations by those who drafted those treaties. A story that existed in the carved stone of buildings, in the water channels that crossed entire continents without anyone wondering who had built them and when, in the underground heating systems that 20th century archaeologists discovered, beneath cities that supposedly lacked such technology in the precise orientation toward the cardinal points of structures appearing in regions that should have nothing in common. That history had a name, or rather, that name was the only thing that survived when everything else was erased: Tartaria. The oldest existing maps, those dating from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and now resting in archives that few visit, in libraries whose collections are rarely digitized in their entirety, show a territory of such vastness that no nation known at that time could have governed it. The cartographers who drew them, men like Guillaume de Lisle, Nicolas Sanson, and Peter van der Aya, used the term Tartaria, or Great Tartaria, to describe a region stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic to the central steppes of Asia. But what these maps show is not merely a geographical territory. It is the outline of something that does not fit into any political category of its time. It is not an empire in the Roman or Mongol sense. It is not a confederation of nomadic tribes. It is something harder to name with the concepts we have inherited: a network, a system, a form of organization that required neither a single capital, nor a single ruler, nor a single official language, because its coherence was not political, but technical, architectural, perhaps even energetic. And this is where the official narrative of the 18th century begins to reveal its most telling cracks. Because if Tartary was simply a collection of barbarian peoples without a state, writing, or technology, as history books have suggested more or less explicitly for centuries, then there are questions those books cannot answer. Why do European travelers who crossed its territories describe cities with architecture comparable to that of the most advanced Western capitals? Why do buildings supposedly constructed in the 19th century in the cities that occupied its former territories possess a scale and complexity that do not correspond to the resources available during that period? Why is the ornamental style repeated on the facades of St. Petersburg, Chicago, Buenos Aires, Melbourne, and Bombay? Cities that, according to official history, were built in the same period but on continents with no connection to one another, so extraordinarily similar? We are not talking about cultural influence or shared artistic trends. We are talking about identical proportions, about materials that do not correspond to the technology available in the region, about underground systems that appear beneath cities built on the remains of something earlier that no one has taken the trouble to fully explain. And 1780 is the year when all of that came to an end. To reconstruct the final hours of Tartaria, it is necessary to understand the dark day not as an isolated atmospheric phenomenon, but as the most visible symptom of a process that had begun much earlier. The archives of the American colonies from that period, which have been studied by climate historians for decades, record something that is not limited to May 19th. The preceding months had brought signs that no one knew how to interpret at the time. The winter of 1779 to 1780 was extraordinarily severe, one of the coldest on record on the east coast of the continent. New York Harbor froze over. The strait between Manhattan Island and the New Jersey shore was covered with ice solid enough for carts carrying cannons to cross without sinking. That abnormal winter was followed by an unusually dry spring, with air that, in the days leading up to May 19th, the colonists described in their diaries as heavy, different, with a smell they vaguely associated with smoke, but which was too diffuse and too constant to have an identifiable source. The sky in the days leading up to the great darkening was not the clear blue of spring, but a yellow, translucent membrane that filtered the light in a way that gave shadows strangely sharp edges. And then May 19th arrived. The darkening began in the early hours of the morning, advancing from the southwest toward the northeast with the deliberateness of something other than chance. The earliest records from that morning come from farm diaries and the notebooks of Continental Army officers who were at that time engaged in their campaign for independence. An officer named Samuel Tenney described the event in a preserved letter. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the sky was already so dark that lamps had to be lit in the houses to read. The darkness was not that of a storm. It was not accompanied by rain or wind. It was simply the absence of light in the middle of the day. The animals reacted as animals react to nightfall. Roosters crowed. Nocturnal birds emerged from their shelters. Flowers closed. Cows returned to the barns on their own. All of nature, with the precision of its age-old instinct, recognized what men could not name, that the day had ended, even though it should not have ended. In the Connecticut House of Representatives, which was in session that day, some representatives proposed adjourning the session and returning home to be with their families, convinced that the end of the world had come. A man named Abraham Davenport objected with words that remained etched in the memory of those who heard them. He said, according to witnesses, that if the world ended that day, that was where he wanted to be found, doing his duty. But the world did not end that day, or at least not the world those men could see. The other world, the one that lay beneath and around and interwoven with theirs without their knowing it, that one was indeed coming to an end. Pause here for a moment, because what we are about to explore together is not simply the description of a strange meteorological phenomenon. It is the reconstruction of what, according to the alternative narrative at hand, was occurring at the same time the sky was darkening over New England, somewhere that 18th century maps vaguely located as the deep interior of the North American continent, in regions that the cartographer from Philadelphia or Boston imagined inhabited by indigenous peoples and nothing else. There was something that the theorists of Tartaria describe as the last functional nodes of the network. Cities or facilities or simply places where the technology that had sustained Tartarian civilization for centuries still operated, ever more feebly, like the last embers of a bonfire that no one has tended in a long time. The image that the Tartarian narrative proposes to understand this technology is not that of machines in the industrial sense that the 19th century would soon make familiar. It is something closer to what we might call today resonance or frequency or an energy network. A system that utilized the geometry of the landscape, the orientation of structures, and the conduction of specific materials to move something that was not electricity in the modern sense, but that performed similar functions: lighting, heating, communication. Perhaps things for which our current technological vocabulary still lacks precise terms. And that system, on the morning of May 19, 1780, was collapsing, not all at once, not like an explosion or an implosion, but rather what in physics is called a cascade of failures, when a node fails and its load is transferred to neighboring nodes, which in turn fail under the added weight, and the collapse spreads at a speed that grows exponentially. The civilizational equivalent of what we would today call a network blackout, but on a scale that has no equivalent in the history of any energy system we know. The last custodians of that network, the men and women who, in the Tartarian narrative, preserved the operational knowledge of the system, even though they no longer fully understood its theoretical foundation, had been trying for decades to keep running something for which they no longer had the necessary resources. The specific materials the grid required to function were no longer being produced. Distribution routes had been severed, and, most devastating of all, the people who knew what to do when something went wrong were growing fewer and fewer, their knowledge increasingly fragmented, their disciples increasingly unable to preserve what they received, because the world in which they lived no longer possessed the categories to understand it. It was like trying to teach someone to repair a high-precision clock using only blacksmithing terminology. The knowledge did not fit into the available molds, and what does not fit into the available molds, time turns into silence. The morning of May 19th had a specific hour that records indicate as the point of greatest intensity. Around noon, in the area most affected by the eclipse, The darkness was so complete that several witnesses describe it as comparable to the deepest hours of the night. It was not the twilight of a cloudy afternoon. It was a total absence of the light reference that human beings need to orient themselves in time. And in that moment of maximum darkness, there is something that standard historical records mention without grasping its significance: the smell. Witnesses to the dark day of 1780 consistently describe, in accounts compiled by later researchers without any of the witnesses knowing one another, a particular smell that accompanied the darkness. A smell they associated with soot and with something else, something they had no name to describe precisely. A smell that several described as metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm, but without the storm. The standard scientific hypothesis regarding the dark day, which attributes the phenomenon to a combination of smoke from forest fires and a dense layer of clouds, partly explains that smell. Smoke has a smell, naturally, but it does not explain the metallic component that reappears in independent accounts gathered in places separated by hundreds of kilometers. And it does not explain the geography of the blackout, which did not follow the dispersion pattern that fire smoke normally produces, but instead formed a coherent front that advanced with a speed and uniformity that climate scholars of the period describe as unusual. In the Tartarian narrative, that smell was the network signature as it collapsed, the olfactory equivalent of what an electrical transformer produces when its circuits burn out, but amplified to the scale of a system that covered the continent. The particles of the conductive materials the grid used dispersed into the air as the failure points began to give way in a chain reaction, produced a chemical signal in the atmosphere that the humans of the time registered with their senses without having the conceptual frameworks to interpret it. The world smelled of Tartaria as it died. There is a detail in the records of the dark day that no standard historical analysis has been able to satisfactorily integrate into its explanation of the phenomenon, not because the detail is particularly difficult to explain if one accepts the forest smoke hypothesis, but because it is a detail that, when placed alongside other details from the same era and the years immediately following, forms a pattern that is difficult to attribute to chance. The darkening of May 19, 1780, was not the only event of its kind recorded during that period. There were similar darkenings of lesser intensity but comparable in nature in preceding and subsequent years, and the map of their geographic distribution, when carefully traced onto historical maps showing the location of the supposed Tartarian territories in North America, coincides with unsettling accuracy with the areas of highest density of what theorists in this field call residual Tartarian architecture, buildings whose style does not correspond to their stated historical context, underground infrastructure systems that predated the cities that used them, monuments and structures that appear in the records of the first European colonizers, without anyone being able to explain who built them or when, as if the collapse of the Tartarian network had left, upon its extinction, traces in the sky that spatially corresponded to the traces it had left on the earth. The dark day as an epitaph, like the smoke signal of a civilization that could do nothing else but signal its own absence. The years following 1780 were the years of the Great Erasure, not only in terms of what was forgotten, but in terms of what was actively replaced. The American Revolution brought about a new political map for a continent that, according to the alternative narrative, had until then had a completely different territorial organization. The French Revolution, 9 years later, began the process of rationalizing the European world that would culminate in the 19th century with the reorganization of nearly all systems of knowledge, history, geography, architecture, science itself. And in that process of reorganization, Tartaria ceased to be a name on the maps. The 19th century editions of the atlases that had so naturally named it in the 18th century simply omitted it. There was no decree. There was no announcement. just the gradual disappearance of a name from the places where it had been written, like a word erased from a blackboard. At first because it is no longer useful, and eventually because no one remembers it was ever there. But this is where the narrative we are exploring becomes both more difficult and more fascinating. Because Tartaria did not disappear completely. It cannot have disappeared completely because something that was so vast does not vanish without leaving traces that time cannot erase entirely. The traces are in the buildings. This is the key that theorists of Tartarian architecture have pointed out for years, with an insistence that established scholars find irritating precisely because it is not easy to refute. There is an architectural style that appears all over the world with a consistency that no theory of cultural influence can satisfactorily explain. A style characterized by specific proportions, by decorative elements that recur with minimal variations on the facades of buildings located on different continents, by a scale that suggests they were designed not for the uses that official history attributes to them, but for something different, something greater, something that required spaces whose purpose was not necessarily the one described in the books. 19th century train stations in American cities, supposedly built from scratch in a territory with no prior architectural history, have proportions that correspond to a canon not taught in any architecture school of that period. The buildings that history textbooks attribute to the Beaux-Arts style or Victorian eclecticism have details that do not fit into any identifiable European stylistic movement. And the so-called water palaces, observation towers, and domes that crown government buildings around the world share characteristics that go beyond mere aesthetic coincidence. What were those buildings originally? The most radical answer from the Tartarian narrative is that they were part of the network, that their proportions were not decorative but functional, that their materials were not chosen for aesthetic reasons but for specific physical properties, that their locations were not arbitrary but followed the geometry of an energy network whose logic we can still read, if we know how to read it, in the landscape of our cities, and that when the network collapsed, when the dark day marked the end of what remained of Tartaria's operating system, those buildings remained standing like the teeth of a machine that no longer works, useful for other purposes, repurposed, reinterpreted, absorbed into a historical narrative that had no place for what they truly were, but still there, still bearing in their stone the geometry of something that was far greater than the uses for which we visit them today. Imagine for a moment that you are there, that it is the afternoon of May 19th, 1780, and you are one of the last custodians of what remains of the network. Not on the coasts of New England, where settlers and lawmakers and farmers gaze at the dark sky and wonder if it is the end of the world, but somewhere inland at one of the last points where the network still emits something resembling a signal, where the instruments your ancestors taught you to read still move, though ever more slowly, ever more erratically. You've known for years that this was going to happen, not the exact day, not the hour, but the process, yes. You've seen it accelerate over the last few decades. You've seen how every winter the system needed more attention and produced fewer results. You've seen how the communication routes to the eastern nodes closed, one after another, not because of any deliberate decision, but simply due to the accumulation of circumstances that made keeping them alive increasingly impossible. You've seen how the young people who came to learn what you knew looked at your instruments with the incomprehension of someone gazing at artifacts from a world they don't recognize as their own. And this morning, when the sky began to darken, you knew it was the day, not with terror, not with despair, with something closer to the resignation of someone who has waited a long time for news they always knew would come. The pain isn't in the event. The pain is in all the years that preceded the event, in every moment when you saw something slip away without being able to stop it, In every conversation where you tried to explain what you knew and met with incomprehension in response. The pain lies in knowing that what is lost today will not be lost all at once, that it will continue to exist for years, perhaps for decades, in fragments that no one will know how to piece together, that the buildings will remain standing, that the canals will continue to flow, that the stone will continue to hold within its geometry the record of what once was. But the knowledge of how to read those records, of what to do with that geometry, of how to reactivate what is now fading, that knowledge will indeed be lost today. And the dark sky over the continent is the sign that that moment has arrived. The darkness of the dark day began to dissipate toward the late afternoon. The night that followed was, according to several witnesses, particularly bright, with a moon shining with an intensity that many described as abnormally bright against the sky that had just regained its usual depth, that bright moon over the restored darkness. There is something about that image that is impossible not to read as a symbol, even if one has decided from the beginning of this story to remain in the realm of speculative fiction and entertainment. A world emerging from its deepest darkness and finding the moon where it expected to find nothingness. A world that carries on without knowing what it has just lost. A world that tomorrow morning will rise and have breakfast and open its businesses and continue its revolution and draft its treaties and build its cities without suspecting that something fundamental changed yesterday in its relationship with the past it does not remember. The years that followed 1780 are, from this perspective, the years of the most successful amnesia in history. Not because anyone planned it with the precision of a conspirator. There is no need to assume a conspiracy when the process can be explained without one. Systems that no one can maintain shut down on their own. Knowledge that no one can pass on is lost on its own. Names that no one utters disappear on their own from the maps. There is no need for a malicious agent when time itself is effective enough as an eraser. And what remained is what we have. The cities, the buildings with their unexplained proportions, the underground systems that appear beneath the foundations of what is supposed to have been built on nothing, the old maps that no one examines closely enough. And the question those maps carry, written in their silence, in the vast space they called Tartaria, without yet knowing they were naming the edge of what their world could remember. 2.5 centuries after that day, we live in cities that rose from their ruins without knowing it. We walk down streets that follow the geometry of something older without any sign to indicate it. We use buildings that were designed for a purpose no one has explained to us, and that no one, honestly, can fully explain because the pieces of knowledge that would allow it are scattered across archives that do not communicate with one another in records that speak languages no one reads fluently anymore. In the very stone of the structures that wait for someone to know how to ask them the right questions. And somewhere in the northeast of the continent, in the archives that preserve the diaries of farmers and the notebooks of soldiers and the letters of legislators who lived through May 19, 1780, are the words of people who saw the sky go dark at noon and didn't know what to say. They didn't know what they were seeing either, but they felt it. Something ended that day, something that has no name in history books, but left its mark on every stone in the world. And if you've ever stood in front of an old building in your city and felt that its proportions speak of something you're not yet able to hear, if you've ever looked at a map of the world's cities and felt that there's a pattern repeating itself too often to be a coincidence, if you've ever had the feeling that the story we were told takes the form of an answer that was designed before the questions were even asked, then perhaps what you felt wasn't fantasy. Perhaps it was the scent of memory, the same instinct that makes birds return to their nests when the sun disappears at midday. The awareness that something doesn't fit, that there's a missing piece, that the world we inhabit is the empty room where something once was that we still don't have a name for. What detail in this story resonated with you the most? The darkening of the sky, the buildings with their unexplained proportions, or perhaps the image of the last guardians of knowledge that could not be passed on? Tell me in the comments, because your answer might point to the missing piece of the puzzle that someone else has been searching for. And if you know someone who looks at the buildings in their city with that persistent feeling that there's something the books don't tell us, share this video with them. Because curiosity isn't dangerous. Curiosity is the only tool we have to ask questions of a world that would rather we didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because this was just the beginning. There are more maps to examine, more buildings that don't fit into their official history, more dark days that no one knew how to interpret when they happened, and history, true history, the kind that is still being discovered, is always stranger and more fascinating than anything textbooks have dared to tell.